There's been a lot of discussion about the most recent executive order that came out about sex. And I wanted to discuss it from a medical perspective. There are five main points that I see that I've read through this executive order that I want to point out from my perspective. There's a lot more I could say about it. There's a lot more I have questions for from a legal standpoint, but from a physician standpoint, there are five things I want to point out. The first thing I want to point out is how they talk about sex versus gender. Now, the first thing that is said is that sex is different than gender identity, which I completely agree with that part. Sex, as you remember, is the biological classification based on four characteristics. We typically use internal and external anatomy, chromosomes, and the hormone driven system, like which of the hormones that we all have, which one is driving the development and functioning of the system? So, those four classifications are what we use to determine what sex somebody is. And then gender identity is that inner sense of self. And they even acknowledge that within the order that that's gender identity. So, that's where the agreement ends there. Because then it goes on to say, okay, from now on, we're not going to use gender, we're just going to use sex. Okay. And it goes on to say that from now on, when we say women or girl, it means an adult or juvenile female. And when we say man or boy, it means adult or juvenile male. Here's the thing about that: women, girl, man, boy, those are all gendered terms. Those are terms for genders. They're not terms for sex. So at this point, they're saying, you cannot claim a gender identity, but we are going to use gendered terms for biological sex. Okay. So I think that's very confusing because you're using different terms for different definitions. That's what I think. The other problem with it is they're saying we're not going to ask for gender anymore, only biological sex. So on documents like passports, social security, any federal information, you have to put the sex that was assigned at birth. And the issue with that is that could put many people in danger because sometimes, depending on where you are and what that says, it can put people in danger, whether that outs somebody for how they identify, whether if somebody's traveling with their passport, how that may put them at risk in a different country, or maybe they have to consider not traveling. It also sometimes allows people to know that otherwise really don't need to know by putting it on federal documents. There's more issues with that, which brings me to the second point. The second point is that it talks about it's only going to recognize two sexes, male and female. Now, if we go back to that definition, that what sex is a biological classification, there are more than two sexes. There are more than two sexes in humans. There are more than two sexes in the animal kingdom. There are more than two sexes. When we use that kind of biological classification, there are more than two sexes. You've heard me say this many, many times that biology loves diversity. Nature is diverse, it is not binary. This is no different. And what that means is that every human being is not have all those four things that I mentioned lined up in what we classify as male or lined up as we classify as female. And for those individuals that don't have all four things, they fall under an umbrella term that we call intersex. So that umbrella term, so they're all variations of what could occur that may have differences in those four characteristics. For example, in Swyer syndrome, there's XY chromosomes, which we classify as male, and there's ovarian streaks, which we classify as female, and the external anatomy would be classified as female. There are tons of different variations. That's just one example of variations like that. And so we classify as intersex. When we classify, that depends on when we can identify it. Some people who are intersex are identified at birth, whether that's because there is something that we can see that may indicate they are intersex, like ambiguous genitalia, or whether it's from our neonatal screening, the screening that we do on newborns, that varies state by state, but something like congenital adrenal hyperplasia, that might be considered an intersex condition. So there are more than two sexes, and that's why many states moved towards birth certificates that included more than two sexes. Because one thing that we know about intersex people is that traditionally, historically, in a very paternalistic way, we as medicine, as a medical culture, used to designate many of these kids and choose for them male or female based on a lot of various factors. Some based on surgically what was possible, some based on chromosomes, some based on, and it varied. It wasn't consistent, depended on a lot of different things. So historically, we chose for the child. Sometimes there was a committee, etc. But for a long time, there was a feeling that something had to be done. And many people have advocated and fought back to say many of those surgeries were elective and unnecessary. Many of those surgeries to make ambiguous genitalia not ambiguous were not necessary and could have waited until the person was old enough to decide for themselves whether they wanted surgery or not and what they wanted, because their functioning was not dependent upon that surgery. States recognized that there was no reason to designate another sex when they were a sex, they were intersex, and that that person could decide at a later time if that's the sex that best identified them, or if being male or female best identified them. They made room. They made room for all the possibilities. So what this is doing is going back and saying there are two sexes when we know there aren't. Now, how they defined male and female, they did very carefully. I had to read it multiple times to really understand it and really think about it to make sure I understood what they were saying. Let me read you how they define female and then male. So it says female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell. Male means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces a small reproductive cell. Now, there's a few interesting things here. They don't mention chromosomes because at conception, we don't know what's going to develop. You may know the chromosomes at conception, but that's it. Yet they don't mention chromosomes. But just because you know the chromosomes does not mean you know how the body will develop, meaning that even if you have XY chromosomes, you may have testes, you may have ovarian streaks, like we don't know what will develop. So they were careful not to mention chromosomes. And as I mentioned, they also don't mention, they use the word large reproductive cell, which I'm assuming they mean the oocyte, and small reproductive cell, which I assume they mean the spermatocyte, but they don't say it. Why don't they say it? I am guessing because they know of the wide variety of biology, that biology is diverse, that if they use one language, what do I always say? Biology is diverse. It is not binary. If they used a term, a biological term, there are exceptions. And so even in this language, it doesn't even say that they will have that reproductive cell. It almost sounds as if they might have it. That's not the word that is used, but the wording, which has been carefully done by somebody that has crafted this over a lot of time and a lot of thought, gives this kind of ambiguous, very general, vague language. And at conception, which is again very confusing because not much is known at conception. But again, I think they're saying what possibly will be, although that's not the wording that they use. So it is their own way of defining sex that we don't. It is not really clear either, but that is how they decided to do it. And I would say, as a physician, I need a lawyer to help me understand what they are trying to say and why. Okay, so that's the second thing. There are discussions of gender and sex, recognizing only two sex. The third thing is that they say gender ideology is false, and they describe what gender ideology is basically the idea that somebody may be transgender, non-binary, or anything other than what they were assigned at birth. They're saying that's false. And it's a false idea. They actually use the term that somebody's born in the wrong body. Here's the thing. Gender diverse identities, transgender identities, non-binary identities have been around since the start of time. Thousands of years. It is not new, it is not fake. The other thing is this idea of wrong body. There are some people that feel like they were born in the wrong body, but not every transgender or non-binary person feels that they were born in the wrong body. That is not the language they would say, even though they do not identify as what they were assigned at birth. I think this is a little bit misleading. To me, it shows misinformation, a lack of understanding of what it is to be transgender or non-binary, and it definitely is not fake. The fourth thing is that they mention that gender identity is disconnected from biology. I disagree. Gender identity is not disconnected from biology. There's this lot we still have to learn, and there's a good reason why many people who are transgender or non-binary do not love some of the neurophysiological studies, meaning the brain studies, that demonstrate some of the differences. What do I mean? The first one that caught my attention, I read, I don't know, over 10 years ago, but it was done before that, like in 95. They were looking at postmortem brains. Now, if you think about the 90s, this was a time when there was arguments of what was the reason for people being brain? Was it biological? Was it societal, etc.? So a group of researchers looked at postmortem brains, brains of cadavers. They knew that there were differences. They knew from mice that there were differences in a certain part of the brain, the basal ganglia, were a greater density of nuclei in males than in females. And I just want to say that that area of the brain does not affect intelligence. The feminist in me just wants to point that out. But that area of the brain is responsible for some sexual behavior. So that's one of the reasons they looked at it. So when they looked at the human brains, they found that human males had denser nuclei, statistically significant, different than cisgender females. When they looked at cisgender males that were gay, they had the same density as cisgender males that were straight or heterosexual. They had a transgender woman's brain, and when they looked at her density of nuclei, it was consistent with the cisgender woman's amount of nuclei, meaning that her neuroanatomy was consistent with cisgender women's anatomy. What consistent based on her identity, not based on her biological sex. There have been other studies looking at functional MRIs and things like that, looking at neuroanatomy, neurophysiology in areas where we know there are differences. And there have been a variety of results that tend to demonstrate the brain anatomy, the brain physiology tends to be consistent with those for which somebody identifies are similar, more so than based on their biological sex. So how somebody identifies. And some studies have shown regardless of hormone treatment, regardless of age, some studies have shown that transgender people run in between the two. Some have shown consistent with how they identify. I'll have to do a podcast based on those studies at some other point. But regardless, you get the idea that There is a biological component. And when you think about the embryology, it makes sense because the body, the thing that we classify sex with, the body develops in the first trimester. The brain develops in the third trimester. They develop at different times. So I disagree that gender identity is disconnected with biology. All right, point number 5. This is more of a concern from a medical perspective. This probably need a lawyer to help us with this one. But there's a comment that federal funds will not be used to promote gender ideology. How do we translate promoting gender ideology? I think most hospitals in this country receive federal funding, if not all. And I don't know how hospitals function as far as how those dollars are earmarked, how specifically they're used or not used. And then the question is, what is considered promoting gender ideology? Is any education on gender affirming care? Is any education on the difference between gender and sex? Is listening to this podcast promoting gender ideology? What is promoting gender ideology? So we will have to see how that plays out. But from medically speaking, I have some concerns for that part of the executive order. When I think of the purpose based on the title, I can't help but think of my medical science research brain, right? When I look, what is the problem that they are trying to solve? So here's the first problem. Allegedly, they're trying to solve the problem, allegedly, of decreasing the amount of sexual assault in bathrooms by transgender individual. Yet that doesn't seem to be a problem. In fact, a 2017 report from the Police Foundation, which is an independent and nonpartisan police research organization, they looked at 4 different cities that had changed their policies to be gender inclusive, and they looked at the number of sexual assaults in facilities before and after they made those laws. So they looked at before the gender inclusivity for those bathrooms and after the gender inclusivity in those bathrooms. And what they found, looking at all 4 cities and a year before and a year after that time, is that they did not find any evidence of sexual assaults taking place in which men, under the guise of being women, or transgender women entered women's bathrooms to commit a sexual assault or otherwise victimize women. So there is no evidence of a problem. There's no evidence that there is an increased risk of assault with transgender women in bathrooms. I don't want to dismiss that there are people that have suffered a trauma. However, when we talk about feeling safe, we have to look at what is a risk and what is something that actually helps people feel safe. The last thing I will say is for anyone out there who is transgender or non-binary or happens to love somebody who is transgender or non-binary, I know this is difficult. And I want to say that you are not wrong. That I hope that you see what is here in this executive order has a lot of error from a medical perspective. It is a harmful and hurtful for solution for something that isn't even a problem. Everybody deserves to feel safe, and that includes you. You deserve to feel safe. Who you are is beautiful and amazing. Because your identity matters. You matter.